Hey, what's up with it, guys? Hey, welcome back to another video. Now, this is going to be my balanced Druid PvP guide. This is going to be kind of an update. The last time I think I posted one of these was back in like phase 1, maybe phase 2. But looking back at that, I had caught a glimpse of my character's items, and it made me realize how much time has actually passed since I made that video. So I want to make this video give you guys two updated talent builds, basically my favorite PvP build as well as a secondary PvP build that is still viable for raiding, so you don't have to spend money on that respec cost if you're trying to do both effectively. I'm going to go over my two item builds that I'm really trying to hopefully get acquired here over phase 5 and phase 6. As far as just itemization, and then I'm going to go over some tips and tricks kind of stuff, some more nuanced things after I've had so many extra hours playing the spec in PvP from the last time that I made this type of a video. So with that being said, let's get into it. Let's go over first my kind of secondary PvE viable build. We have 35 points here in balance, 0 points in feral, and I have 16 points here in resto. Now first, let me preface this by Moonkin form specifically. The biggest critique or kind of comment that I get regularly kind of bashing balanced PvP in general is that Moonkin form itself doesn't have that much value. And I get why people say that. There are matchups where Moonkin form is absolutely not useful at all, and I don't use it, but you really have to think of this more as you are committing 34 points into balance to be able to get the increased damage from all these talents. None of these talents, to me, like pretend Moonkin form's not here. Can I scroll up just a little bit? There we go. All of these talents are necessary if you're wanting to play balanced DPS PvP. Like, these are all very significant as far as how they feel, the amount of damage that you're actually able to do. The range is absolutely necessary. Natural shapeshifter, I would say, is absolutely necessary given my playstyle. All of these are necessary. So what ends up happening is you have one extra point that you could throw into some random spot if you can find anything that you think is valuable. Long story short is that it's not there for me. I can't justify it in any of these other points, and so for that reason, Moonkin form is obviously part of this build. But don't get hung up on this. This is mostly going to be just balanced Druid PvP and being able to do as much damage as possible, casting our damaging spells, and that's our focus. Okay, so try not get too hung up on this. I will talk to about a couple kind of niche situations where Moonkin form actually does have a lot of value, and I'll talk about that a little more in the gearing section as well. Now, one thing to talk about here in the top row is if you are a big fan of Nature's Grasp, you can shift a couple points over from Improved Wrath and put those in there. It's totally up to you. I have found that I actually don't really like Nature's Grasp if I only have a couple points in it, as it's still pretty random. It shares the same not cooldown, but like you can only have one root up at a time. So if you root someone and then Nature's Grass someone else, you can't have both of them CC'd. It's like a whole thing that I'm just not a huge fan of this in general. It is usable in Moonkin form, so there is that. But us being Horde side, where I also have War Stomp, I have Bash, I have these other abilities where I can set up my roots. I don't have a huge amount of value that I place in this kind of RNG, hopefully it procs, passive root buff on myself. Again, preference up to you guys, and you definitely can get that. You could take these 2 points out of improved enrage and throw them over here, but the rest of this balance tree should be pretty straightforward. Like always, if you guys have questions on any of this, hit me down in the comments below, or come check out any of the streams and I'm happy to answer and kind of explain any of this stuff there as well. Feral, we have 0 points. Resto, I have 5 points in Furor. We have improved healing touch, reflection, insect swarm, and like I had said, 2 points in improved enrage. Now, the other thing that's important to mention is if you're the only Druid in your raid, it's going to be important to have improved Mark of the Wild in your raid. If you have resto Druids that don't PvP very much, they usually will have this anyway, which is my case. There's two resto Druids, 1 or 2 that come to our raids that do have improved Mark of the Wild, so for that reason I don't need to have this talent. And Furor is absolutely amazing in PvP, and I'll go over that here in just a little bit. Healing touch is absolutely a necessity if you are healing at all. If you watch any of my streams, you'll know that on fights like Oro sometimes or Twin Imps, a lot of times I am actually healing on those fights. So improved healing touch is absolutely necessary for me currently in our current raid situation, even as a balanced Druid. Reflection is also a very strong talent. It does help us a lot over the entirety of a raid. However, since we don't have a ton of spirit on our gear, at least like our best in slot gear, this is not going to be as valuable for us as a balanced DPS as it will be for something like a Resto Druid that's going to have twice as much spirit on their gear. Literally, if you think about our best in slot, Bloodvine, Mashundere, Mana Igniting Cord, or the belt off of Cthulhu, the gloves off of Cthulhu, both of our best in slot rings, none of those pieces have spirit. Rock Fury Bracers, the cloak off of Cthulhu, literally not a single piece has spirit on it. So our actual spirit is actually going to be very low. It's basically our base spirit with buffs. That's it. Our items are basically our gear outside of your weapon potentially is not going to really give you hardly any spirit at all. So the value we gain from this talent is much lower than something like a Resto Druid or someone that has a lot of spirit. This talent basically equates to 14 spirit equaling 1 MP5. So you just have to keep that in mind. Depending on your gear, this talent will fluctuate in value. So just keep that in mind and don't get too hung up. A lot of people think this is absolutely necessary 100% of the time. And while it is a good talent, 12 or 15 MP5 is not absolutely mind-blowing, out of this world, game-changing talent points. So don't get too hung up on that. I think a lot of people get really hung up on reflection specifically. But yeah, before I don't want to rant too much on that. Insect Swarm, pretty straightforward. No value really at all in PvE, but this does have a lot of uses in PvP. And you'll notice if you watch any of my PvP videos, I do use this pretty regularly if I'm playing this spec. Now let's go on to my favorite PvP build. This is going to be, let's close this so it's not confusing, but this is going to be my go-to. If I was just PvPing 100% of the time and that's all I did, this would be the build that I would run. I've played this build a couple times and absolutely love it. There's a couple points here that you can change around and I'll go over those here in a second. But on the balance tree, you can see it's basically exactly the same. This is my favorite setup when it comes to balance. Same point as I mentioned before regarding Nature's Grasp. On the feral tree here, we have 5 points in ferocity, which is absolutely necessary, way more so than feral aggression, because this does not have very much value. This has a ton of value. If you're in either bear or cat, this allows you to throw out a lot more abilities. And once we talk about the gear, you'll understand more of why this build kind of makes the most sense to me when it comes to PvP. Down in the second row, we have Brutal Impact, which is absolutely amazing. This makes your bash, I believe, a 5-second stun. These 3 points in Thick Hide, you can leave in Thick Hide. You could also put them in Feral Instinct. If you do a little more War Song, Feral Instinct might be better because having the improved stealth in your cat form is actually kind of significant when you're talking about trying to sneak into the flag room and grab the flag. But both of these talents do have values in just 2 different ways. So this is going to be 100% up to you. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you do have the Cloak enchant that improves your stealth, I believe this would take this up 1 point. The way stealth works, don't want to get too involved in that, but it would basically make it where this point this talent is 4 out of 5 rather than 3 out of 5 if you have the Cloak enchant, I believe is how it works, assuming it works the same way Rogues does. And then Feral Charge, obviously down here, which is a very, 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 very good talent once you get the hang of using it in PvP. Then on the Resto tree, we have Furor. Now, Furor and Feral Charge are an amazing combination when you're talking about talents just in general. That's why so many people play some kind of hybrid between all 3 specs, basically grabbing Feral Charge and Furor in almost every single one of the really commonly used PvP specs. Now, basically what we're doing is rather than, putting points down to get Nature Swiftness or putting points down to get into Heart of the Wild, we're committing our alternative points into our balanced DPS, maximizing our Starfire burst potential and just the highest burst that we can possibly do. Now, this playstyle you have to kind of think of as you're really relying more on your Feral Charge and your Bash, really allowing you to set up these big Starfire casts. It gives you 1 additional route, 1 additional either gap closer or a way to create distance if you're charging to a target far away. And then Bash being increased, pounce duration being increased is another good way to ensure that you're able to land. You can Bash and then land a guaranteed Starfire out of that Bash and then root after that. There's all kinds of different combinations you can use once you start messing with improved Bash as well as having improved Starfire. There's a lot of cool combinations you can do off of that just because of the amount of CC that you have just in the Feral tree. Now, another thing that's really, really significant to talk about is just the play style that comes with this a lot more, is that you're not going to be playing this kind of like run around, Moonfire, Insect Swarm, run away, Moonfire, Insect Swarm, Runaway. This is like a little more in your face and a little more bursty. So if you end up having to sit in bear form and DPS, running the gear, which I'll talk about in a second, you have Ferocity, which lets you do that. You have Improved Bash. You have the Thick Hide talent. You have Feral Charge to get away. So the playstyle is a much more aggressive playstyle to me, more so than it is like the normal kind of like caster druid run away from everything type of thing. Don't get me wrong, you definitely want to keep your distance because it'll allow you just to free cast and do way more damage, but this is a build that you can DPS. These talents right here are kind of the really big ones to be able to DPS in both cat and bear form, as the reduced cost on all your abilities is really significant for just how that playstyle feels in general. Now let's talk about the gear, and this might make a little bit more sense regarding the itemization. So I have two sets of gear. Basically, one is the full tier 2.5 with some offset pieces, and then the second one is going to have 3 pieces of the Warlord gear, the epic PvP gear, as the 3 pieces is going to give us the 20 stam bonus, as well as the increased movement speed in cat and bear form and travel form. It's going to kind of come down to preference on these two. I would say that the tier 2.5 is going to be easier to get for most people. However, I do actually think if you are playing this build where you have a good amount of points in Feral, I do think that the 3-piece of the PvP, epic PvP gear is going to be better because you lose only about 20 spell power for the change between the two sets. And you lose a little bit of intellect, but you gain health and you gain a good amount of strength and agility just because the way the stuff is itemized. So again, all tier 2.5 in the head, shoulders, chest, legs, boots slots. On the neck here, I have, this is the amulet off of Twin Emps, but you could also have Choker. The Firelord is another great neck piece you could have here. We're basically all caster DPS focused offset pieces. I have Cape of the Trinity, which is off of Bug Trio, I believe. You have Burrower's Bracers. Now this is kind of up to you here. I would probably use the Insignia because the point here is you want to be at 3% hit and then basically maximize all your other stats. So that's why you don't want to be using necessarily a lot of your PvE gear because you don't want to be having a bunch of extra hit. And then we have Band of Force Concentration is what we want to use here. So sorry, I had to swap that. So this is what I've been running, and kind of my go-to is I have Bracers of Arcane Accuracy. You can also use Rock Fury Bracers, but having the extra intellect is really significant in PvP, in my opinion. We have Locomere here in the main hand. You could sub this out obviously for any other one-hander. I have Master Dragon Slayer's Orb, which is off of the Neff head turn-in, and this is really good because it's just raw damage and healing, raw int, and raw stamp, so you just get a lot of raw value and stats from this offhand. And I really do like having the one-hand offhand combination, allowing you to use things like the book off of Onyxia that summons the skeleton, I can't remember what it's called, and the Skull of Impending Doom, Furblog Pouch, things like that. Once you kind of get used to using those in PvP, it ends up being a pretty significant part of your playstyle. Most of the time, there's a lot of really kind of significant value in those offhands, and so for that reason, that's kind of why I lean towards this one-hand offhand combination. Now on the gloves, I have Gloves of Ebru. You could also use something here like the gloves off of Cthulhu, but since Gloves of Ebru are leather, you end up gaining just a lot of value from these because you ideally in a perfect world want to have full leather if you can help it. Onto the belt, we have Ice Stalker's Waist Cord. There's unfortunately not really any good leather belts. There's the one off of I think it's Lord Kazakh. That's okay, but it's not that great. You lose a lot of damage, and it's going to be hard for most of you guys to get. But again, any of these Man Igniting Cord, Fire Maw's Clutch, all of these are kind of serve the same purpose. But Ice Stalker's Waist Cord, if you can in a perfect world, that's going to be the go-to in this slot. And then tier 2.5 legs and boots, like I had mentioned. We have Ring of the Fallen God off of the Eye of Cthulhu turn-in, Band of Force Concentration. I almost always have Toep in one of my trinket slots because Toep just has so much value and is such a short cooldown, and I absolutely love this trinket. That's going to be a hard one to get to. Ideally, you guys are engineering, and I swap my trinkets all the time, and using PvP trinkets in combination with the nets and the reflectors and all kinds of stuff like that. The trinkets are kind of up in the air, but you can see with this setup we have 2% hit in our rings and 1% in our bracer slots, giving us a total of 3% spell hit, which is actually spell hit cap for PvP. Now you can see here, our health is going to be just under 4,400. We're going to have 5,800 mana. The enchants I'm using here are the Druid enchants, and even though these aren't our best for actual DPS, 10 stam and 10 int is a lot of value in a PvP scenario. The 24 healing, while it's not helping our DPS output, you heal all the time in PvP, so there is value in having this. These are just the most value for sure. Again, the shoulders, pretty straightforward, 18 spell damage from the ZG enchant. Improved stealth, you can also go, the improved stealth is a pretty expensive enchant. It's like a 500-600 gold enchant because it requires 2 black lotuses, but you could also go like the 5 resistance to all or whatever, 3 agility if you wanted to. Then we have 4 stats to chest, 7 int. You could also do the 9 stamina enchant here on your bracers. 30 healing is the go-to here. The same ideas. There's just no good DPS caster enchant for us. You could throw on like 15 agility if you wanted to for like the cat DPS type thing. That's kind of up to you depending on if you play a more feral playstyle or not. And then minor move speed is absolutely necessary on boots, in my opinion. Now, the comparison set here, PvP set 2. Oh, that's why it did this weird. No wonder. Okay, that makes more sense. PvP set 2 is the High Warlord gear, basically the Warlord gear. So I have the Warlord shoulders, boots, and gloves. Now, the reason why this is my favorite combination of the 3 items is that the tier 2.5, and basically in every slot, the tier 2.5 has more stats and it's more stamina and intellect heavy. So that's really kind of my personal preference when it comes to playstyle, is having a lot of stam, a lot of int, and a lot of spell power. The tier 2.5 beats the High Warlord gear in all of those categories. However, the boots are very, very close between the High Warlord boots and the Genesis boots. You can see here you are losing a little bit of spell power, a little bit of int, a little bit of stam. You're losing a little bit of those stats that we actually really would preferably have, but you're gaining the 3-piece set bonus, which is 20 stamina, as well as the move speed, which is really significant. And once you have played with it, you'll realize how big it is and just how slippery you feel as a druid and being able to get in and out of situations. It's pretty significant. Here on the shoulders, it's the same thing. You can see we only lose a little bit of individual stats. One thing too it's worth mentioning is the High Warlord gear, or the Warlord gear, is very high in armor for some reason compared to other stuff. So you actually do gain a good amount of armor rocking these pieces as well. Onto the gloves, one big thing here to mention is you lose all the intellect. So you lose 15 intellect on the gloves. However, you gain the stealth detection passive. And while this isn't make or break, this is worth noting, because if you do run points, like I was saying, in the feral instinct talents, and you have these gloves, you end up having a real big advantage that you don't have otherwise against stealth classes. This can be big if you are really heavily responsible for stealing bases or defending bases, like I am in the AB groups that I play with. That's a really big part of what I do. So for me personally, it has a lot of value to me, because being able to out stealth these rogues or feral druids, things like that, are going to be really important. And even though you might not be able to pull it off all the time, there is some value to be had in that passive bonus on the gloves, and you are going to lose some damage and some spell crit, but it's not absolutely devastating. You do gain a huge amount of agility and strength by comparison, and like I had said, armor, because the gloves of Ebru obviously have none of those stats. So this is going to allow you to do a little bit more damage. You can see all these pieces, you basically end up net positive when it comes to strength and agility and armor, but you lose a little bit of intellect and a little bit of spell power for doing so. Now you can see down here, if we look at the stats, we gain a little bit of health, we lose a little bit of mana. This is compared to the tier 2.5 setup, but you can see we gain strength, agility, stam, we lose int, we gain spirit, and we lose 21 spell power. But we are gaining 15% move speed in travel, cat, and bear form. So to me, and in my opinion, this is, I think, going to be my favorite go-to setup, because that's not a lot that you're giving up for that 15% move speed. It's not worth it if you were having to sub out the chest, the helm, or the legs. You end up having to, that's why I'm not going for rank 12, because if you lose the legs, you lose a ton of stats, as far as stats that we want as balanced druids. So these 3 pieces basically make us give up the least amount of stats in exchange for that set bonus, and it actually gets us much higher when it comes to our health pool, as 18 extra stamina is pretty significant when you're talking about high-end gear and PvP. Again, keep in mind this is unbuffed, but yeah, those are the 2 sets of gear that I'm going to be really trying to go for, and I think both of them will have their own value in their own ways, and I think this first set is going to be a lot easier for a lot of you guys to be able to get. The rank 13 gear, depending on your server, is going to be relatively difficult and is going to require a lot of commitment, but I do think at the end of the day, the rank 13 gear is probably going to pull ahead slightly if you're more inclined on the feral playstyle. All right, now a couple of little nuanced things that I want to talk about is kind of some of these talent points and the value in kind of macros and stuff. Now, a big part of these matchups and what people are saying that Moonkin form has no value, or why are you using Moonkin form, I will tell you, against things like mages, hunters, warlocks, I almost never use Moonkin form because mages, the only time I use it against mages is because they can poly. So sometimes I'll use it to prevent their poly, or I'll shift in and out of Moonkin form to break roots and things like that. Against warlocks, it doesn't help at all because you want to be able to decurse and heal yourself, which you can't do in Moonkin form. And against hunters, you want to be able to poison cleanse yourself and gap close as much as possible. So that's why bear form or travel form and get in their dead zone is going to be way more beneficial than sitting in Moonkin form. Not to mention you want to basically keep abolish poison on yourself. So those matchups, all those matchups, I don't really use Moonkin form at all, or it has very, very little value by comparison. But things like rogues, and warriors, even against, you know, ret pallies, there's a lot of times where I do end up using Moonkin form because you're still able to keep more or less full DPS and still have a huge amount of armor. I think if we can pull up these gear sets here, and it shows us if we're in Moonkin form. Where's the armor? In Moonkin form with this set, we're at just under 9,000 armor, which is crazy. And these 3 pieces of gear, you think it's not that much, like it's 40 armor here, whatever. Those 3 pieces of gear are giving us an extra 600 armor in Moonkin form. So that's nothing to scoff at. I mean, we're really, really beefy. Keep in mind that's with no armor rings, no armor trinkets, no armor weapons, anything like that. That's just straight up from our gear. So again, you have a lot of tankiness with this setup in Moonkin form. 9,000 armor versus something like, let's see, if we're in no form, it's probably like, yeah, just under 2k. It's a huge difference when it comes to damage mitigation from physical classes. That's the difference of surviving a kidney shot or dying in kidney shot. 100%, no question asked. Like if you're in human form and you're against a good rogue, you're 100 to 0 dead unless you have your PvP trinket. If you're in Moonkin form, you can survive that sustained, that whole stun lock, you can survive. And there are situations where you do have that value because of Moonkin form. Now, the other thing I want to mention and touch on is improved Enrage. Now, Enrage reduces the armor, so against things like rogues and warriors, you don't necessarily want to use this, but if you're against something like a warlock or mage, you can actually pre-hot yourself, go into bear, pop Enrage, and then frenzied regen, and you have a huge amount of healing happening on you in bear form. And the Enrage is actually not going to give you any negative side effects because you're playing against a caster. So there is a lot of value, in my opinion, in improved Enrage, helping against clothies or, you know, caster DPS, if that's what you're playing against as far as matchups. Again, I wouldn't necessarily, you know, I would prefer running Feral Charge and Improved Bash. These are more impactful in my opinion. But just if you are running points and you have a couple extra, that's a big value that I have in this. Also, if you're in bear form and say you're like line of sighting, or if you're flag carrying, things like that, having the extra 10%, or sorry, the extra 10 rage that you can use with an ability used in bear form and not have to like power shift in and out of bear form to gain the 10 rage from Fuhrer. This ends up being able to save you mana, things like that, depending on, it's kind of like a very situational type thing, but there is a lot of value to be had in this, especially combining it with frenzied regen. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is macros here, and I'm not going to go super in depth in macros because this is a pretty I have a lot of macros and I've talked a lot about macros in general, But there is one that I want to touch on that's a big one. Let me see if I can find it here. It's my Feral Charge macro. And what I basically do is, this is my keybind that I use. Here it is. And I can post this down in the description below. But this is a really big part of just my overall playstyle and fluidity with just Druid in general, is you always, no matter what spec you're playing, want to have access to using all of your different forms. There are times where you're going to want to sneak around or open on someone in cat. There's times where you're going to try and survive in bear, and there's times where you need the move speed from travel. And then Moonkin form is just one more layer on top of that. Once you start getting good and comfortable with Moonkin form, same kind of idea. There are situations where each form is going to be the strongest form that you want to be in at that given time. One thing to help accomplish this is by minimizing the amount of keybinds you have and combining them into each other as much as possible. So this bind I have here shifts me into bear form and also casts Feral Charge. Since those two things cannot happen in the same global, right? The shifting into bear form is a global cooldown, and then Feral Charge is a subsequent follow-up global cooldown. You can have these bound into one ability, and it's not going to immediately trigger both of them. So basically, you press it once, it shifts you into bear. You press it twice, it shifts you into bear, and then Feral Charges on the next global, assuming you hit it at the right time. You could also do something like bash with this setup as well. If, say, maybe you're not playing the Feral Charge build, you're playing the PvE build, and you want to be able to shift into bear and then bash, and you're not trying to keep a bunch of keybinds, on the top of your head. But it's a really kind of important aspect of this. And the other thing I want to mention is my cancel form button. I use this all the time. I use this a lot. This is there's a lot of kind of weird, finicky synergies, or like I don't know how to describe it, but just the way abilities work with forms and things like that, it can be really clunky. So this is a button that I hit all the time that allows me, if I'm trying to do some combination of my abilities, this allows me to help manually cancel my form so that I can, shift out and cast Abolish Poison, or shift out and heal, or shift out and curse or root, decurse or root, or whatever it is. So that's another thing. Those are the two kind of macros that I use all the time, that Feral Charge bear macro, and then just a / cancel form / dismount macro. That's, pretty much it. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys. And you have something to take away from this. Like always, feel free to ask me questions down below. I always do my best to get to every comment and answer all your guys' questions. And let me know if there's some alternatives of some kind of gearing or playstyle stuff, talent things that you guys have had a lot of success with. But these are my two kind of go-to builds currently at the moment, and the gear that I'm trying to get my hands on here in the near future. You can expect a lot of PvP videos once I'm able to get some of these pieces dialed in, and we're able to spec back to our Feral Charge PvP build. I'm going to just be PvPing nonstop and putting out a bunch of videos on that. So like always, comment, rate, subscribe. Let me know if you guys have any questions. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.